Hello, everyone. Hope you're all enjoying the summit and getting a lot of important takeaways to work on. My name is Ayman Chaudhary, and I'm the head of Global Compact Network Canada. For those who are not familiar with Global Compact Network Canada, it is the Canadian chapter of the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative, United Nations Global Compact. Our core mandates are to help businesses adopt the 10 principles of UN Global Compact around human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption. Also to help businesses accelerate action towards the Sustainable Development Goals. Globally, we have more than 14,000 businesses who have committed to the principles and are actively working with us to strengthen their commitment to sustainability. I am honored to moderate this panel session today, where a lot of what we do are deeply connected and helps improving the overall accountability and transparency of the organizations. But before I begin and introduce the panel, I would like to acknowledge the land I'm calling from. It is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wanda peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, including Inuit and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Now, going back to the panel topic, which is using standards and accreditation to raise the bar for social purpose business. From our panel discussions today, you will get some very useful, important updates about applicable standards and accreditations. However, I would strongly encourage you that you apply all the takeaways from today's discussion using the framework of the SDGs. The SDGs provide a comprehensive framework for the world to work together to create a better future to 2030. Businesses can make a huge impact towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. And the good news is that this isn't just good for humanity, it's good for businesses. It is increasingly evident that enduring commercial success is linked to a commitment to sustainable development. And to fully benefit from this association, businesses need to encapsulate it in a clear purpose. That purpose should be compatible with the SDGs and need to shape the way the business is both designed and run. At the end of the day, a purpose is still a choice, but it is a choice that is increasingly recognized as a necessary condition for the delivery of the long-term value, both to direct stakeholders and wider society. With that, as we set the SDGs framework as the North Star, let's hear from our panelists today what standards and accreditation you can use along the way to improve the overall transparency and authenticity. For this discussion today, I'm honored to have with me Joyce Su, Director of Business Development, B-Lab US and Canada, Toby Hibbs, CEO and co-founder, Corporate Knights, Victoria Hurth, co-convener, ISO 37000 Corporate Governance Standard, and Michael Leering, Director, Environment and Business Excellence Standards, Canadian Standards Association. With our 4 standards experts on this panel today, we will explore the role and value of standards, certifications, and accreditations, and the importance of transparent accountability for social purpose companies. Before I go to our panelists, a quick note for everyone in attendance. In the chat, you will see a link to a draft social purpose assessment tool. This tool provides a link to 25 business practices which social purpose can be expected to demonstrate. After we hear from our panelists, we will ask you to provide input on this tool in breakout groups. Also, we have time to have some questions from our audience directed towards our panelists. And please post your questions in the chat, and we'll try to go through as many as we can. With that, let me start our discussion with the panelists. And my first question to all the panelists is to actually understand from their organizational point of view, what is the approach they are taking towards standards? Specifically, what is the goal or purpose of the standards or certifications or accreditations? How they were developed, and more importantly, why do they matter? I'll start with Michael, and it would be great, Michael, if you can respond to this question after briefly telling us about your organization.
All right, Amen. It's really nice to be here. Pleasure to be here with you today and talk about standards and the value they can bring to social purpose. So let me just first off start off by just explaining CSA Group, or the Canadian Standards Association. We're made up of 2 major organizations under the CSA Group. The first is a not-for-profit, non-government standards development organization, which is where I work and develop standards, mostly within Canada. But we also have a number of commercial subsidiaries that are focused on testing, inspection, and certification, that are really focused on helping keep Canadians safe. The purpose of our organization, the Canadian Standards Association, is to create a better, safer, more sustainable world where standards work for people in business. And our mission is really to hold the future to a higher standard, which is pretty ambitious and broad-based, but at its foundation, especially with purpose being at the forefront of today's discussions. CSA Group at our core is dedicated to safety, societal good, and sustainability. And we've been here helping keep Canadians safe for over 100 years. So with that, maybe just let me turn also to just some stage setting for today's discussion about standards in general. I wanted to just provide, an overview of how standards are developed generally, which kind of applies to all of our speakers today. And, one example I often hear is that CSA Group writes standards. And I think it's important to highlight and focus and clarify that it's more appropriate to say that CSA facilitates the development of standards. Our responsibilities as standards development organizations are to convene leading experts from across the country to sit around the same table. We also have the responsibility to make sure that those sitting at a table developing standards come to the table with diverse viewpoints and expertise in mind. So we ensure that there's government representation, academia representation, public consultation, and industry as well. So we make sure that there's a diversified group of experts. And within CSA specifically, we rely on over 10,000 expert volunteer members that come and support the development of these standards. So I think that's really important to highlight as we kind of start to talk about standards, because it's important to understand that they're developed with expertise from not only across the country, but also from across diverse viewpoints, where we build consensus on the inclusions of a standard. I also just wanted to highlight, the development of international standards, because we will be talking about international standards as well, which is very similar, where we are convening experts, but maybe more so at an international level. So the viewpoints that are expressed are on behalf of member countries that are participating within the standards development work. So commonly, we will be running, mirror committees within each country that will be watching and participating at the international standards development and sending comments and information on that country's view on the applicability of the content of standards. So again, it's important to kind of level set that, standards are developed with consensus at mind, utilizing a number of experts from the given field. So with that, I can turn to your main question and just why do standards matter, and my thoughts on the value of standards. And I think, if we look at social purpose and the imperative of the topic of the day, if we were to, for example, define societal good as something that benefits the largest number of people in the largest possible way, standards can do exactly just that. So if you're looking at clean air, clean water, healthcare, standards can support so many by their implementation. I think that first and foremost is something to recognize about the breadth of its ability. The second thing I wanted to highlight about my views on why standards are important and why they matter is that they always provide consistent and predictable outcomes. So the implementation of standards, you have your shoulds and shalls, and when a standard is adopted and implemented holistically, you can really understand the concrete, tangible outcomes. And to your points about the Sustainable Development Goals, we've done a lot of work, and ISO has also done a lot of work at mapping and linking the usage of standards to the Sustainable Development Goals. And again, noting that standards provide these consistent, predictable outcomes, we can start to link the usage of standards, things like a new standard that we have on implementing flood resilient design for new communities. If a municipality were to adopt that standard and implement it, you could specifically tie a narrative back to SDG 13 on climate action, and more specifically and importantly, the targets within the SDG goals. Target 13.1 on strengthening resilience and adaptive capacity in climate-related hazards. So by applying national standards on, say, for example, flood resiliency, you can also make sure that we share and know that strong linkage to tangible action on SDGs. And lastly, maybe before I turn it back, I just wanted to also note that from my viewpoint, I think standards also do a fundamental benefit to society on improving and supporting transparency in reporting. And maybe one example I'll showcase is when it relates to greenhouse gas accounting and carbon markets. And, there's a lot of work that's gone on to understand carbon markets and how greenhouse gas accounting is done. But, we've adopted and developed a lot of registry systems that are based on ISO 1464, the International Greenhouse Gas Accounting Standards. And within those standards, there's 5 key principles, and one of them is transparency. So, if we apply that standard, and within our registries, we do require all those principles to be maintained. And as people try and get an understanding of what are carbon credits or what are offset, like carbon reduction offsets, how does one organization reduce emissions here, and then how does that work? That principle of transparency in that standard allows us to ensure that all the documentation on how greenhouse gas reductions were quantified and reduced are publicly transparent, so the public can see the greenhouse gas reports that follow the standard. And that's kind of how we start to drive even transparency through the use of standards as well. So I'll maybe leave it at that because I know we're short on time, but just some quick views on standards and where they're playing a role already.
Absolutely. No, thank you so much, Michael, for actually setting the stage about standards discussion and also sharing your point of view about why do they matter. I know it's a lot to digest in such a short time, but I think the invitation to audience, if you'd like to connect with Michael, I think you can always do that to know more about the topics that we are briefly mentioning here in the discussion today. Next, I'll move to Victoria to hear her thoughts about the question that I've asked. Victoria, again, if you could please just start by introducing yourself and then go respond to my questions.
Yeah, hi everybody. Great to be part of this exciting summit in purpose-driven business week. So that's fantastic. I have a number of hats. I'm a pracademic, so I work across theory and practice, trying to drive towards businesses that can help deliver long-term well-being for all, which is, for me, the definition of sustainability and the goal of an economy, ultimately. So in theory, it should all be working well, and of course it isn't. So I've become very involved in standards building as part of my strategy to help achieve sustainability, long-term well-being for all. And as part of that, I'm here to talk specifically in terms of relation to your questions, the standard that I spent 5 years helping lead the process to bring about, which is ISO 37000, governance of organizations. So whilst it covers and encompasses corporate governance, it's actually governance of organizations as a whole. We had a year of scoping and then 4 years of development. 77 countries were signed up and involved out of the 164 that are part of ISO, and 25 liaisons. And just supplementing what was said about the importance of standards, that, ultimately what matters about ISO is that it is a membership body. It is like Michael said, standards building and ISO, as an example, is just a highly refined process by which the world can come together and decide what it thinks about a topic. It is really nothing more than that, but ISO is a membership body. So 164 countries have national member bodies, standards building bodies that are one level removed from politics. And that provides a very unique, as we move into this complex international set of issues that we have to deal with urgency. I really don't feel that we can do that without taking full advantage of ISO 37 of ISO as a whole. So 37,000 as a standard overviews the integrated view of governance, 11 principles. It has purpose at the center, which you'll all be very pleased to know. And that purpose that is a stakeholder defined contribution in service of something external to that organization. And then core principles that cover the foundations of direction, accountability, and oversight, and then supporting principles. And together these work to help companies to really deliver purpose-driven organizations. I would say also, I'm also involved in, I'm technical author for what will be the first national standard in purpose-driven organizations, PAS 808. We have a really exciting steering group, including B Corp, Future Fit Foundation, government, KPMG, and we now have and various others, and Anglian Water and CISL, who I work for, and it's coming out for public consultation today for 4 weeks. So I'll put the link in the chat, and it would be great, to move that forwards together. And building on the fantastic work that you'll be doing in the breakout sessions, looking at what Canadian view is of that fantastic social purpose assessment tool, which we can unite this thinking. So I think I've got just under a minute left. So I just wanted to dig into some of those questions that you had about sort of why we need standards. And I think we need them more than ever, and we need international ones more than ever, because this is an urgency that we're facing here. We have to unite our energy. We cannot waste our time on different terms. And really the hard work of standards is uniting fundamental concepts. It doesn't really matter what we call it. If we know what we're talking about, let's just decide on something and go with it. And that then allows the accountability to drive through. So, nothing can hide in the dark if we have that level of accountability. And then lastly, there's a lot of potential empire building in this space that's not purpose driven. And by using these sort of defined processes that are a service for the world, that are multi-stakeholder driven and are transparent, then we can really make sure we get the holistic responses that we need, rather than being diverted into places that are less useful. So I'll leave it there, and I look forward to answering some of those further questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and thank you so much for sharing that update about the recent consultation paper and your amazing work on that paper. Please do share the link here with on the chat so that everyone can also access that report that you mentioned. Next, I'm going to move to Joyce. Joyce, again, like everyone else, if you could please quickly introduce yourself and respond to the questions that I've asked. If you want me to repeat those questions, I can do that too.
Thanks, Eamon. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. My name is Joyce, and I work for B-Lab US and Canada, and I'll talk a little bit about what we do. I work for B-Lab. We're a nonprofit. It's global, and we certify businesses that are committed to meeting the highest standards of social and environmental impact. And we call them certified B Corps. So it's an accreditation, and they get a logo. And there's, we have a global community of over 4,000 B Corps. Some of the names you might know, Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, locally BDC, Coast Capital, which is, I believe, is involved. And then, Frank and Oak, and then of course, Corporate Knights. Toby's also here. So hi, Toby. Beyond that, it's not just about the standard, but it's a community of businesses that are looking to redefine what success looks like. And so our vision is of an inclusive, regenerative, and equitable economy. The core value of our economy is purpose-driven, and it's to create benefit for all stakeholders and not just our shareholders. And so that means that we believe business is to be conducted as if people in place mattered, and that we should aspire to do no harm and benefit all. And so, how do we do that? The question about why are standards important, I think that's one of the reasons. It's like, how do we know we're actually doing what we want to do and what we're hoping to achieve? So what we use is we base our standards on an impact assessment, and it is a free tool that you're welcome to take a look at. And it is it's been around since 2007, and we're in our 6th version right now. So it's been updated every about 2 to 3 years. And we talked about how our standards determined. They're determined by an independent standards advisory council and a group of experts in sustainability across the globe. We also have advisory working groups that help us focus on specific topics. And we also do a public survey for all our stakeholders in order to provide comments and updates to our assessment. And so, we talk about consensus and experts at the same time. What that assessment looks like, there's over 200 questions, and our fundamental philosophy at B-Lab is that it is around comprehensive multi-stakeholder consideration. And so when someone goes through the assessment, they're going to look through areas of governance, your customer impact, your community impact, your environmental impact, and then your employees' impact. And basically, you need an 80 out of 200 out of the available points to actually certify. The one thing I will say is that in terms of like the why and the importance, I think what we believe is that the B Corp model goes beyond just the performance piece. There are 3 things that we believe are required to make a B Corp. And one of them is performance, that you have to meet a fundamental level of a standard. And the second piece is transparency, that when you certify, your score is made available for people to see on our website. And the last piece is around the accountability piece. And beyond the performance piece, we have what we call a mission lock, where we require B Corps companies to actually embed this value into the DNA of their company through some sort of legal change. And in different regions, it looks different. In some regions, it's just a legal change in their articles of incorporation. In other areas in the States, it's actually a new form of a corporation called the benefit corporation. And so I'll just leave it there, and I'll let you introduce your next person.
Thank you so much, Joyce, for sharing all those great updates. And with B Corp, UN Global Compact is also working extensively, particularly on the SDGs front. I believe the B Corp and UN Global Compact together, we created the SDG Action Manager tool which is again to help businesses to understand how best they can do the assessment around what impact they are creating with their SDGs initiative. So great
Yeah,
work. Thank you
absolutely.
so much for
Yeah,
being there with us.
It's a great partnership for sure.
Absolutely. With that, it brings me to my next speaker, our next guest, Toby.
Well, thanks, Simon. It's a pleasure to be here. My name's Toby Heaps. I'm with Corporate Knights, and we're a media and research ratings organization that exists to advance an economy that works for people and the planet. We've been busy with, I feel, almost 20 years now, focusing on building an evolving standard to define what corporate leadership is, corporate sustainability leadership is. That standard now includes 24 different key performance indicators that are defined across different environmental, social, and governance fields. The most important of which look at the nature of a company's products and services and the nature of their investments in terms of the impact they have on society. And so that involves industry-specific definitions that align with evolving norms and frameworks in other countries like the EU, sustainable taxonomy, and go beyond in many cases to capture some of the social elements. And so it's a new language. This we call it a clean taxonomy, and for the specific pieces that define the clean economy part, we also look at other metrics, from resource use like carbon emissions on a scope 1 and 2 basis, things like the extent to which a CEO's pay is linked to sustainability, things like the injury rate of or the tax payment rate, the cash tax payment rate over profits over a period of time compared to peers, and we define peer groups in which it's relatively fair to make comparisons of companies on those normalized metrics over time, including the improvement rates. And so that's been a real labor of love for us, and we use that as the basis to generate our corporate ratings and also some of our more well-known rankings, including the best 50 corporate citizens in Canada and the global 100 most sustainable corporations in the world that comes out each year in January, of which we just finalized this week. And so we have an appreciation for the importance of standards that come from the private sector. And ultimately, I think it's important for the standards to be reflected in the classical governance mechanisms we have too, in terms of, it's interesting to look at things like organic, how the USDA kind of took that over. And it's a little more challenging for non-environmental characteristics, and in the past, that's been an excuse that I don't think we have the luxury of making that excuse anymore. So we're moving into prime time. We have, we noticed the international, the IFRS, which is the international body that regulates and sets accounting standards globally for most countries, has now launched an accounting sustainability board to come up with some metrics rapid fire that will be quickly incorporated through soft law around the nations of the world with respect to corporate disclosure and other entities that report to IFRS standards. So we're happy to see the quickening pace of evolution in this space. To your question about why would a social purpose standard matter? Well, I think there's just two general things about standards in general. For anything important, if you don't have a standard, you're going to get two things. You're going to get confusion, and you're going to get a lack of accountability. And so we know in this space of social purpose, there are a lot of companies claiming different things: social purpose washing, greenwashing, lots of different types of washing. Not always, I guess washing your clothes is good, but greenwashing is not so good. And so there's a real danger if we don't have some clarity on the standards for the currency of social purpose to be diluted and for it to be to lose credibility in the eye of the public and to become something that people can become cynical about. And so if we want that trust to be maintained in the public, it's really, really important to have credible standards. And then when we get to the accountability part, I always come back to Peter Drucker. His famous quote, I'm sure many of you are familiar with: "What gets measured gets managed," and that's so true. And so if we can have clear measurement mechanisms, then that enables people to manage, enables people to be held accountable around those things. And so that's why we believe in standards. And I think on the specific question of social purpose itself, and why social purpose is important, especially from a perspective of business right now, because our challenges are so great and the power of corporations and businesses is so large that there'll be no way for us to effectively tackle those challenges without companies rising to the occasion, which will require governments as well. We shouldn't live in a sort of an imaginary world where this will happen in a vacuum of public policy. It has to happen together. We need the leadership to raise it, but we really need this leadership and higher purpose from companies at this perilous and challenging time. And I always go back to this quote from the philosopher Alfred North Whitehead, and he said something to the effect of, societies achieve greatness when business think greatly of their roles, and social purpose standard is part of defining that.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Toby. I think the work that your organization is doing around corporate social purpose rating is going to be a groundbreaking work, because this is going to actually really force organizations looking into the purpose of their business and how they're actually defining the purpose. So really looking forward to the development of this rating system. And anytime you have more updates, please do share with us, and eagerly looking forward to it. And also, thanks for sharing your opinion or your thoughts about how and why standards should matter. Amazing. So now that we have set the stage about and I hope after hearing from all of our 4X team experts, it is a lot more clear to our audience today, why do standards matter? But I just wanted to, when I have you here with me, I wanted to quickly understand from you, when people work with standards, and you have been working with standards for so many years, what advice would you give to them that what makes working with standards successful, and what pitfalls they need to avoid? So from your experience, whatever you have seen, whatever has helped making their standards work successful, please do share those. And also some of the danger points, whatever things that they need to be very careful when they're approaching standards, or they're trying to fulfill or meet some of the standards in their own practices. So I'm going to go with the same flow, my initial questions. So let's start with Michael, and hear your thoughts about that question.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to kind of elaborate on how and where standards work. Again, I maybe just reiterating some of the pieces from the outset and just why and how standards provide those valuable tools. I think first and foremost, it's important, again, to recognize that standards embody and embed the expertise of so many, and they're built on the consensus of a diverse group of experts within each field. So that, I think, is really at the core of importance that we need to recognize, is that, they're not written by one individual, they're written by a group of experts with diversified views. That's important. What I didn't mention at the outset as well, I think is critical, is that, the standards development process, whether it's at the ISO or at a national standard level, they follow an accredited process that's overseen by, for example, in Canada, the Standards Council of Canada. And that accreditation process and directives ensure the balance. It ensures things like a 60-day public review, which Victoria noted. We have public consultations on standards as well. So not only are standards, developed by expertise, but they also consider public consultation and input during their development. So those are critical pieces to keep in mind. Again, noting as well that standards are valuable and important because they provide those consistent and predictable outcomes. If you're looking at addressing a certain specific area like flood resiliency or electrical safety, having the understanding of what the requirements are is important to be able to follow. So I think that's really critically important. And then lastly, maybe as far as how and where standards work, it's also important, I think, to note that standards have a life. And standards are continually refined and continually updated with the expertise around the table. And within Canada, we have a requirement to update and review standards at a minimum of every 5 years. So that, again, is another important consideration, especially when we think about things like governments referring and referencing standards, things like the Canadian Electrical Code, which is the CSA standard. The reason why it provides value to government is that we have a review and revision cycle where it's continually updated. So as we look at, social purpose and focal points where we can make value, we can put all these things to work. To speak to maybe pitfalls and things to avoid, as far as what I've seen, I think the first thing I'd maybe mention is to avoid competition in the standard space. There's a lot of different moving players that we need to be cognizant of, and it's inherent on every standards development organization, whether that's ISO or national, that we don't compete in the standard space. The realm of social good, we need to collaborate. We need to make sure there's harmonization and we're not duplicating efforts. And that, sometimes we can fall into that pitfall as far as like duplicating efforts. So we need to recognize what's going on. IFRS is another good example, Toby, about, where and how, international standards development is coming. So we need to be cognizant of those pieces. So that's the first pitfall. The second pitfall I've seen happen that's thankfully being addressed is ensuring consistency between standards and avoiding duplication, even within standards themselves. An example of that is, you look at the plethora of international standards. There's hundreds of ISO standards. And as they start to embed and address and incorporate climate change considerations, for example, it's important that standards in the agricultural sector, the healthcare sector, that they use the common definitions of what a greenhouse gas is. And those standards are set by a specific environmental committee. So consistency between standards is also important to make sure that we're not replicating or duplicating definitions, for example. Right. And ISO has addressed that by convening international coordination bodies. We're helping to support ISO's Climate Change Coordination Committee, and their specific mandate and purpose is to make sure that the plethora of ISO standards follow the same definitions and guidance on what greenhouse gases are, what climate change is. So we want to make sure that we also don't find the pitfall of replicating definitions that's already maybe potentially in a parent standard. And then lastly, maybe before I turn it back, the other pitfall to avoid is, cautionary notes on the partial adoption of standards. At times, governments, industry, or others will adopt parts of standards, and sometimes that can cause challenges and risk losing, key updates and inclusions. We have one example of like a sustainable finance taxonomy that's coming forward in Canada, and sustainable finance is, a very big growing area globally. And in Canada, we're looking at the transition taxonomy. And it's important to recognize that within that standard, there's two major parts. One is the foundational principles, and then the second is the transition taxonomy itself. And it's important and inherent to understand that you can't just apply the transition taxonomy. You need to understand and overlay the principles of the document and keep them together. So another pitfall to avoid is, this partial adoption of standards, or taking, what may seem like the most pertinent pieces, but it's important to encapsulate and adopt and incorporate, key principles that are part of the standards. And those are fundamental for where and how that social purpose, things like transparency that I spoke about earlier, really comes to light. So that's, I guess, just my views, but I'm really keen to see the thoughts from others as well.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing those great important points, particularly about the point about the consistency and also about the partial adoption. I think those are some really good points that anyone who's pursuing their approach towards standards, they are being very careful, and they're making sure that they don't fall under that trap. For sometimes people try to rush process, and that's when those happen. Okay, let's hear from Victoria next. What are your thoughts about some of the pitfalls and also some of the opportunities?
Yeah, thank you. And thanks to Michael for doing such a great job again, so I don't have to cover a lot of things there. I would emphasize as well, where you have a management system standard within ISO, there's something called the high-level structure, which essentially forces the development of those standards to adopt a certain pattern, a certain structure, certain language. Once you move into guidance standards, it's a little bit looser, and that's what I'm working on. But nonetheless, there is a lot of work to try and coordinate. Of course, it's never perfect, but that's the intention. So I'd say that, the first thing is a standard, and these are what it should be, and therefore pitfalls are not doing it. It has to fulfill a genuine need. And so for me, focusing on purpose and governance, for me, those are two absolutely critical things, as Toby touched on, really. We're at a critical point, and we've now recognized, I'd say really clearly, and we can say it out loud, that the issue that we face is that we focused on an assumption that financial income will automatically result in long-term well-being for all. And we forgot what the ultimate ends are, and we haven't taken no notice of the ultimate means, and we've just been myopic, as Daly pointed out very long time ago, Herman Daly. So focusing on the right standards and putting the energy there, I think is really important. And again, in terms of governance, we can drive accountability and try and measure all of the individual actions that we think that organizations should be doing or we can focus on understanding what is the governance that can bring that about. And let's go really, really large on making sure that that governance system is really good. And we're a long way from that at the moment. So 2 other standards we're focusing on now are indicators of good governance and how to advise governing bodies to deal with indicators. So we hope that will move in that space. I think it has to also be at that right point where where there's enough consensus in the room. So when a new issue comes in, and purpose was in that space, you start by everyone going off in their own direction, and that's a creative period, and we need that because we need to be people to think deeply and look at it from different perspectives, and then come together and say, okay, so we now realize that we're doing more harm than good, going off, doing our own thing. We need to bring this together. So it's got to be at the right point. It's also got to cut, and this is really, having convened, sleeves rolled up, 100 plus meetings, 3 hours, a time, a pop, is to really cut beneath the issues. Often we're saying the same thing in just a slightly different way. So being able to excavate down and say, what do we really mean here? And that way we can cut through. And in areas that people thought, oh, it's not possible to standardize that. Yeah, it actually, we have much more in common, especially now we've moved into this new paradigm of purpose where we can really cut to the chase, I feel. I think we are in that place. So finally, just some couple of small things is to say, and someone put in a comment in the chat about regulation versus voluntary. The standards are all, certainly by ISO standards, are all voluntary. But they really do fill an institutional void. So especially countries that don't have that institutional capacity will look to standards and lean on them. And doing that and knowing they're on firm ground, for example, that it's internationally accepted way of thinking about something is really important. So they play a massively important role. But we know that regulation and legislation is always sort of slow to act, slow to respond, and is almost just the minimum level. So I think this, fast moving or relatively fast moving standards building, I think really can set the outer edge. And that PAS I was talking about, which is really pertinent here, really saying what are the worldviews, principles and behaviors of a purpose-driven organization. Once we've got that nailed and we say, no, this is it, very hard then to use the concept of purpose in a way that doesn't relate to it. Now that means the accountability is driven from the system itself. Because I don't know really that you'll ever get to the point of legislating for all the aspects we need. We need a normative approach to it. So I'll stop there because I know you've got a lot to cover. Thank you.
No, thank you so much, Victoria, for sharing your thoughts and also for responding to one of the questions that we have received from the attendees. Wonderful. Next, let's hear from Joyce. What are your thoughts about that? Some of the pitfalls and some of the opportunities?
Yeah, thanks so much. I definitely resonate with what Michael and Victoria said. And also Toby, I think one of the things that it's important is thinking about what are the problems that we're trying to solve for. And it's like actually addressing those things. And so one of the areas around standards is we talk a lot about policies and practices, which I think we assume will solve for those things, but we don't really know. And so being able to find a way to assess your outcomes and your outputs as part of the standards is an important part to see if you're actually doing what you're hoping to do. The other thing that I heard over and over again around the fact that standards are living and they need to be revisited, and there's constant updates that are required from different stakeholders and different perspectives. And I think we're really seeing that, but standards do take time to get that consensus. The problem is, I don't know if anyone else feels this way, but I feel like the world is changing way faster than it was 3 years ago. And so it feels like we just need to there's like so much to keep up with. And sometimes our standards aren't able to keep up with all of that. One really simple example, I wouldn't call this a pitfall, but it's our reality, is like how quickly our world changes is like in the past year in terms of our societal awakening around racial equity and what roles businesses need to play in that is something that I think everybody recognizes, but it's more than just putting a public statement on your website, but there are systemic things that you can do, but we don't have a global perspective on standards of that exist already. And so I think that being able to exist in a community of partners, and so, being able to, the idea around competition, but having partners of other experts in this space that can provide us a point or some sort of spotlight of where we need to move to, that we can get our community of businesses, or we can actually highlight some of the businesses that are doing some really cool things that will help us build upon our standards. So not really pitfalls, but just kind of where we are today, that standards will not be able to address everything that we're trying to work with, and that we still have to be in the forefront of like listening and doing and hearing from the leaders in the space.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joyce. And I completely agree with you that at least for the last 3 years, we are seeing that things are changing at a lot like accelerated pace. And to some extent, COVID-19 could be a reason for that, because companies have actually been forced to, a lot of companies, to do a reboot and see, okay, how do we do things now that we have faced the consequences? How do we restart better? So that's where a lot of these amazing discussions are also coming in. And we are seeing that people are taking this overall standards discussion, sustainable discussions way more seriously than what we have seen before. So hopefully things are going in the right direction. And we hope
one thing I would add to that also is that a lot of our standards normally feel built on like some sort of scientific basis, or things that are like the consistency of language, and people may be hesitant to create something or start something new that doesn't seem as solid in that sense. And I think being able to try, you have to start somewhere, and to start with trying to define what it is that you're trying to achieve. I think we need some of that like courage to be able to do so as well.
Absolutely. Okay, thank you so much, Joyce. Next, I have Toby. Toby, what are your thoughts about what makes standards work and what pitfalls to avoid?
Sorry, I have just 3 thoughts on this one. So I think this is applicable to all standards. We live in this sort of age of infinity, where our email boxes are piling. The servers and clouds are full of information, and we need to understand with everything the importance of scarcity, and small is beautiful, less is more. So I think this is for all standards. A 2,000 point standard is probably way less useful than a 3-point standard, and so it's often getting the signal over the noise. Less is more. I think that applies to all standards. There's always this sort of hunger to add to the list, and there's real costs that are not often calculated when we do that. So I can't overemphasize enough the importance of less is more. And many elements are super indicators, of a standard that broadly correlate with many others. And so, like for example, when we were looking to try and grade companies on COVID preparedness, there was about 60 indicators we looked at, but we found there was one indicator that was you could get good data on, and it was also really highly correlated to all the other, to where you could get data for all the other, and it was whether or not a company offered at least 10 paid sick days of leave, no hassles for employees. And that was the sort of super indicator. And that told us more about who was leading and lagging than all this other stuff that the other 59 indicators put together. And so just the importance of less is more. Now for standards that are for management, I don't have as much expertise or really much expertise in that area at all. But there's a big difference, I think, between standards for management purposes and standards for accountability purposes.
Right.
And what we've noticed is for accountability purposes, it is absolutely critical that we steer clear of processes, measuring processes or having that as part of it, and focus on outcomes. 2 examples. If we look at the companies that have the most developed policies, most words for climate action, you'll find a high correlation between those companies and the highest emitters of carbon emissions, and even with the companies that have the biggest growth in emissions of carbon. If you look at things like companies that have the most words on policies about anti-corruption, often you'll find those companies implicated in corruption in much more pronounced ways than companies that have less words. So it's the importance if it's an accountability standard, the importance of focusing on outcomes over processes is really important. I understand for management purposes it can be different. And then the last piece is radical transparency. The more that standards can incorporate that as a core principle, the better, the more sunlight and disinfectant we have to keep things honest. And so those would be the sort of 3: less is more, outcomes, not processes, and radical transparency.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Toby, for sharing your thoughts on that. While we are waiting for more questions from the attendees, I actually do have some follow-up questions for our panelists today. I'm going to start with Michael there. So we heard a lot from you about like how do we approach standards and how standards matters for companies and other government entities. But what would you say that how to promote standards and take up of standards, particularly to companies? What would be your suggestion on that?
Yeah, thanks. And that's a major challenge that we have. We're often hiding in the background, and we need to do a much better job of advocating and informing of new standards that are existing. One example is flood resiliency, where we have now a portfolio of about 10 new national standards. So between bioretention systems, erosion sediment control, and others, we have these standards that now exist, and we really do need to make sure that folks are aware of them. So how to promote standards, how to promote the uptake of standards. I think first and foremost, it's just really awareness. And, things like this is a good piece of understanding how standards can play an important role. But I think the major, aha moment that I've had recently with regard to getting further uptake and utilization of standards is really this work and connection to the Sustainable Development Goals. I think we are still at a turning point in society where there's a lot more focus on social purpose, and thankfully for that. So understanding how standards can play a role in things like the Sustainable Development Goals. Like if you're focusing on any one of the 17 goals, having resources and tools available to make meaningful action. Governments have signed up to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, but they're kind of silent on how we're going to get there. And we're trying to take it upon ourselves to promote the uptake of standards by making these linkages to the SDGs, so that organizations can understand that if they're applying and utilizing these standards, which by the way they could have been doing anyways, they can note the fact that there's meaningful contributions towards Sustainable Development Goals. And to one of Toby's earlier points as well, it's critically important to eliminate the greenwashing of these kinds of claims. So that's where, with our mapping exercise and mapping standards and SDGs, we went to the target level to actually understand, like, are we actually doing the target? Not just like a broad stroke, like, oh yeah, well, this is addressing climate change. We need to understand what is the specific target that a standard can help motivate and mobilize action towards. So I think that is probably fundamentally one of the main areas where I think we can promote the use of standards by just informing people of the strength and power of what they hold. And hopefully today we're able to clarify a lot of these steps about how they're developed, why they're useful, and what other meaningful pieces they link into. And I think that's really what we're trying to do. And just get out there and advocate and bring awareness to the fact that we're out there doing this good work to help individuals and organizations and governments achieve meaningful change.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing your thoughts on that. We got another question from the audience here. Someone is asking, can you elaborate on radical transparency? Toby, was that you who used that term? Okay, can you please elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. So if a company wants to say that it is, like, let's say if you had a standard around green revenues that a company earns, and if a company wants to say that, we're earning, some companies, this is what a lot of companies do, they'll say, we earn 33% of our money from green purposes, or Canadian pension funds. We just looked at 12 large Canadian pension funds, and you had about $160 billion being invested in what they called sustainable investments. And then you say, well, what do you mean by that? And then some of them would break it out and say, well, some of it's in renewable energy and some of it's in green buildings. And then you say, well, what do you mean by green buildings? LEED certified. Well, what do you mean by LEED certified? LEED gold. And so being really specific, because if you say things like, we have 33% or we have $100 billion of green investments, that's not being transparent. You have to sort of be transparent to the level, the radical transparency is going into the granular detail and making that information available, if it's important, in your integrated annual reports on your website putting it in the public domain. So being granular and in the public domain are sort of the two kind of foundation parts of radical transparency. You see it happening for really important things by really large, important institutions, and they speak in such vague terms that they would never get away with when they're talking about their investment returns. Imagine they said, oh, we had pretty good returns, we made 10%. Well, for what time period? Was that annualized for all asset classes? Like, you have to be specific and granular, or the words are vague and much less, they don't achieve the meaning that is required.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Toby, for giving that clarification there. Victoria, my next question is to you, following up on the question that I asked Michael as well about how do we promote standards in companies. But as you have worked with standards for so many years now, what do you say, like how to promote standards globally?
Yeah, I think the thing is that if you're fulfilling a real requirement that the world needs, and you have a good group of stakeholders that you get involved in the process, because like Michael said, it's only as good as the people who are in the room. It is a process. Then often that happens naturally. So we've just launched 37,000. I was at COP last week. I was doing lots of presentations, and the whole network is out there sort of spreading the word, I would say. So I'd say that's really good. I wonder whether maybe I can answer a slightly ancillary question, because I think one of the things we have about standards, we have some fantastic standards out there that are not, that haven't gone through ISO or national member process. And a sort of a vision that I have, and I'm testing this because maybe there's something I'm not thinking about, is that we have some fantastic standards that just don't have that traction globally. And within the world that those standards are being made in, they're having huge impact. But to get to that next level where they might be considered coming into regulation, where they can really have that traction, I would really suggest, bringing those into the ISO process. And my question to people is, if you're not doing that, what is the barrier that you're facing? Because I'm keen, and I know ISO's keen, to help unlock those barriers, because it is the world's resource for bringing the world together on these topics. And if we're not using it, the question is, why aren't we? Because for every great company like B Corp and like Corporate Knights that has a multi-stakeholder approach to it, there are groups that don't have that kind of approach and are able to influence all our lives, but in a non-multi-stakeholder way.
Great question, Victoria. Michael, Toby, Joyce, you'd like to respond to that? Why it's not working?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Victoria around I just take it for granted. But when we look at about 500 different standards that deal with environmental sort of label certifications. And the first thing we look at is this a multi-stakeholder approach? And that used to be actually pretty good, but now a lot of companies and organizations have figured out to have sort of pseudo multi-stakeholder, or pseudo audited, audited sort of verified a multi-stakeholder, but the stakeholders are all selected from one stakeholder. And so really understanding if the power of the multi-stakeholder is shared equally, and the shots are not all called. And it's really difficult for these standards. Like fair trade is basically dying.
Right.
And it's become almost like consultancy for other companies to verify their own definitions of sustainable sourcing. And so it's really important to, I guess, also stand back if we all believe in standards and the importance of standards, and they're a huge public good, and yet we don't fund them properly. An organization like Fair Trade that has built up that brand over decades to be reduced to approaching irrelevance, it's really it's not fit for purpose for our times. And when we think about foreign aid, when we think about development funds, we could probably do a lot of good by investing even just a fraction of a percent in what we do in overseas development. Or it doesn't have to come out of that bucket, but there's a real need for more public investment in meaningful multi-stakeholder standards, and for those standards to exist. Because a lot of the governance models, that you get paid, if you pay to get rated, that really, kind of, people always ask us when we do the Global 100 rating, how much do we have to pay? It's like, no, that's not how it works. We're just doing the rating. Everybody gets rated if you're a certain size. But there's many organizations that use standards to do ratings. They get money from those that they're rating. And so it's a real kind of problematic governance structure. And it would be a really small amount of public resources to address this, but it's a huge public good that is being massively underfunded.
Right. I think we don't have much time here left for the session, so I think I'd just like to ask one final question to have your final idea for how to foster continuous improvement and trust and transparency in social purpose business. So from your experience, please try to respond to this question in just 1 minute. So let's start with Michael. Do you want to repeat the question?
No, it's good. I think my answer is adopting standards. I really do hope that collectively we've been able to showcase kind of the value here, and I think it's been a great discussion. So my takeaway or final thought would be, the advocacy for adopting standards and harnessing the potential that's embodied in them.
Excellent. Victoria?
Yeah, I'd just like to say, let's get all involved with building the standard, the global standard that we need. And, it's fantastic that we now have this PAS out for consultation, and we need to be preparing for the time where I hope soon it goes into ISO level. So everything you're doing on the wonderful work that Coro's been doing on the social purpose assessment is a way for Canada to get its consensus together. And if you can look at the PAS at the same time, so we can start building, the bridges between, then we set ourselves up for really having that standard. So, yeah.
Excellent. Joyce?
Yeah, I mean, as Michael had mentioned, if standards are always being updated, then you're going to embed the need to actually increase and improve, because standards are always going to be increasing in terms of what our expectations are. The other thing I would say is, we talked about how do we get people to adopt it? You need them to care. And so one way they care is through consumers. The other way they care is through their employees. And if you're able to engage your employees to say, this is what we're working on, this is the standard that we have and that we're bought in, and get them to buy into it, they get really excited and they want to see themselves improve. So I think there's a bit of that engagement that's required. It's not just management that's going to be working on it.
Absolutely. Toby, your thoughts?
It just from my more narrow perspective, but building on Joyce's point, and in translating to action, we've been working on a rating for social purpose for companies with Coro Strandberg and the Social Purpose Institute, and we will be publishing the sort of findings of that on a group of leadership companies in the early new year, and sort of what gets measured gets managed, and if you publish that in the media, it can amplify that feedback loop, and so that's how we're going to try and contribute and advance this evolution.
Absolutely. Great. Well, thank you so much. I think it was a great conversation. And going back to Victoria's question, I think that's a very important point, Victoria, that you have raised. Like, how do we actually make all this thing work that we already have in front of us? And how do we make sure we actually get the benefit of the work that has been done? I think in this panel, at least today, we have some really good multi-stakeholder organizations, including BLAB, Corporate Knights, us, the UN Global Compact, and also Canadian Standards Association. I think it is going to be very important for us that we stay connected and we continue the conversation from here and see how best we can actually take the discussion forward from here. It was wonderful kind of listening to all the great thoughts that you guys have around standards and how companies and government can use standards for the better use, and also to make companies more transparent and accountable to our social purpose company business option. With that, I would like to conclude today's panel session. However, as we have mentioned, that we do have a breakout activity for this panel, and the link that will be used. So there, if you see in the chat, a link has been provided. So click the link provided, scroll down to the assessment tool that starts with practice area 1. And in the breakout room, please introduce yourself, name, title, and organization. Please write it there. And review the practices in the assessment tool and discuss particularly 2 broad questions. Would these practices give you confidence this was an authentic social purpose business? And what is missing? What could be improved? What we are really trying to do is kind of validate the social purpose assessment tool that we have in front of us and pick a brain, like what do you think that we are probably still missing, or what you think are really working well. So your opinion and feedback on this tool would be really valuable for us, and would sincerely appreciate your cooperation on that. So with that, I'm going to leave you to our tech team to take you to the breakout room now, and please click on the link. And thank you so much again for your participation. I look forward to seeing you again in the next sessions. Take care.